Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, the Ngunnawal people, and acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and contribution that they make to the life of this city and the region. We'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be attending the lecture today. The lecture today, this is the third and final centenary lecture that the IAE is hosting in this, the 100th anniversary of the City of Canberra. This lecture is being delivered by Professor Richard Duncan. Richard is a relative newcomer to the Institute. He joined us at the start of this year, and he's leading one of our research programs called Conservation Ecology. Richard was awarded his BSc Honours in Forestry Science from the University of Canterbury in 1988 and his PhD also from the University of Canterbury in 1991. After that he worked for a while at Landcare Research, a place I know and love, before taking a postdoc position at the University of North Carolina in the early 90s. After that he moved on to Lincoln University, just outside of Christchurch in the South Island of New Zealand, and started working his way up the academic food chain, and was ultimately appointed as a professor at Lincoln in 2007. And we enticed him to come over and join us last year, and Richard joined us at the start of this year. Richard's got a pretty formidable reputation in global ecology. It's largely premised on his highly innovative approach to extracting value from data. Richard's got particular approaches that unlock data ways that other people don't readily see. He was recognised by the New Zealand Ecological Society a few years ago with the Te Tahu Teo Award. Apologies for the pronunciation, which recognises outstanding contributions to the science and application of ecology. And this evening, Richard's going to be talking to us about the impact of humans on avifauna on remote Pacific islands.
Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming along to listen. So I'm going to talk about some work that I've been involved in over the last few years, really trying to understand extinctions. And this part of the work I'm going to talk about is all about past extinctions and what we understand about, especially first human impact in arriving in new places. But the story I want to tell starts, and to provide a bit of context, starts a long time ago. And this is a diagram here that shows essentially the movement of modern humans out of Africa to colonise the land masses of the world. So we know us, Homo sapien, modern humans, evolved in Africa 150 to 200,000 years ago or so. By 130,000 years they occupied most of the sub-Saharan African continent. And then around 70,000 years ago people started to move out of Africa, first moving up and colonising Asia, reaching Australia 45 to 50,000 years ago, and similarly into Europe sort of 40,000 years ago. And then during the last ice age, when there was a land bridge across the Bering Strait 20 or so thousand years ago into North America, and by 12 or 13,000 years ago had reached the far reaches of South America. And effectively by 13,000 years ago, humans had occupied all the major continental land masses on Earth. What we see as people colonise those land masses step by step is that each time humans arrived in these new places, there was a massive extinction of many of the large animals that lived in those environments. So here I've just highlighted the core areas. So in Australia, for example, we know that around about 40 to 50,000 years ago, most of the largest, particularly herbivorous mammal species died out. So in Australia we lost 15 of 16 of the genera of mammals greater than 40 kilograms on this continent. Fewer in Europe, but a similarly large proportion in both North and South America. So following human arrival step by step as it colonised these land masses, associated with that was a disappearance of particularly these large mammals and particularly large herbivores, but also often the large predators that were associated with those herbivores as well. All right, people have known about this major extinction event for a long time, and ever since people figured out it happened, there's been debate about what caused it. And there's two main drivers that people have speculated caused this major loss of species. The first one is just major climate shifts. This is a period during a period of ice ages where temperature and vegetation were fluctuating strongly throughout these periods, and there were major shifts in climate and vegetation across the globe that people have argued could have driven a lot of the changes that we see in terms of changing composition and loss of these species. So climate shifts are one of the core reasons people have argued cause these changes. But it's sort of undeniable as well that each of these changes occurred after humans arrived in those areas. And so the idea too that humans were a major contributor to these extinctions via hunting primarily, but in places like Australia also the potential to alter other environmental features through the use of fire and those sorts of things. But especially the idea that there was this overkill of these animals, people arrived and they essentially hunted them out to extinction. Now the problem we got, of course, is that these things happened a long time ago. We're talking, 45 to 50,000 years here in Australia, for example, and it's really hard to find evidence back then as to exactly what was going on. The fossil record's patchy, we've got really limited information about what was occurring. And so these things are tough to get a handle on, and they're difficult to disentangle because they also occurred at the same time. At the same time as humans are moving around this landscape, the climate was changing. And of course, it's not necessarily an either-or outcome. It's quite likely that both of these kinds of factors could have contributed to what was going on back then. But the guts of it is that it's actually hard for us to really understand what impacts humans had and to disentangle that from a whole lot of other things that were going on at these times. So as I mentioned, by about 13,000 years ago, humans had colonised all of the major continental land masses on Earth. But there remained this one large region of the globe that hadn't been colonised by humans. And it's this vast area of the Pacific Ocean. And of course the reason it hadn't been colonised was because it largely comprises small, extremely remote islands that are a long way from anywhere. So we've got this huge portion of the Earth's surface out here that remained uncolonised. And it remained uncolonised for a remarkably long period of time. So we know people in Australia 45 to 50,000 years ago. We've also got good evidence that by about 30,000 years people had moved out into the islands Papua New Guinea and associated offshore islands around that. So this is probably roughly the extent to which people had colonised this area by 30,000 years ago. And then only about 3,000 years ago, people started to move out into the Pacific. And it wasn't people from this region that colonised the Pacific, it was people from further north that moved down through Asia and out into this Pacific region here. So there's evidence that by about 3,000 years ago, people had moved out into the islands of New Caledonia and probably out about as far as Fiji. And then it seems people stopped. They seemed to pause. And then in a series of a couple of slow hops, they slowly moved a bit further out into the ocean. So by about 1,000 years ago, they'd moved across the islands of Tonga, Samoa, and about as far as the Society Islands. And then again, people paused. And so there appears to be a period of a couple of hundred years there where nothing happened. And then all of a sudden, 700 or 800 years ago, people exploded out into the very far remote reaches of the Pacific. And so this occurred in a very short space of time. Within a period of a couple hundred years, people moved from the Society Islands as far as Hawaii, out as far as Easter Island, Rapa Nui, in the far reaches, at least that far, and finally reaching the South Pacific and New Zealand only just over 700 years ago. So relative to the rest of the sort of continental land masses, this area of the world was colonised extremely recently by people, only within the last few thousand years, and for these far-flung remote islands of the Pacific, only within 700 or 800 years ago did people eventually arrive at these places. And at the end of the chain sits this landmass here, New Zealand, and it's the last known landmass on Earth to be colonised by humans. And we've got it's very well dated. So the first archaeological sites, the oldest archaeological sites in New Zealand date from 1280 AD, so just over 700 years ago people got there. And this photograph here is the Wairau Bar in the northern South Island of New Zealand, which is where the oldest archaeological site sits. So found at this site here were burial remains of people, and actually dietary analysis of the bones of those people suggests that there's two kinds of people buried here on the Wairau Bar. One kind of people that have got bone composition that indicates they come from this area, that they are local New Zealanders born and bred in this place. But a second kind of composition that suggests that they come from elsewhere, and the closest match we have again is in the Society Island. So there are people buried on this Wairau Bar that appear to have two origins, people that originated in eastern Polynesia and people that were born in New Zealand. And so it looks like this site here is the very first site where people arrived in New Zealand. And again, like I said, we've got very good dating. It's 1280 AD is the date when people arrived. Now, alongside these, the burial remains of people at these sites are a whole lot of other bones as well. And early Europeans who looked around for at these sites where they could find evidence of the sort of prehistoric occupation of New Zealand also found a whole series of animal bones in those deposits as well. And this is a photograph of Richard Owen, who's an English sort of anatomist, paleo-anatomist. And one of the early bones that was discovered was a large fragment of a leg bone that was sent to the UK, where Richard Owen identified this as a large bird, larger and more colossal in size than the ostrich or any known species. So it's a ratite bird related to ostriches and emus, but much bigger than anything anyone had found before. So here's Owen. He's actually holding the fragment that got sent to him in England of the original moa bone that he identified this bird from that one piece of bone. And now he's standing beside a completely reconstructed skeleton of what it was that he had identified from that bone fragment. And it's this enormous moa, a species of Dinornis. And Europeans quite quickly realised that alongside evidence of early Maori occupation was evidence of these birds that occupied the landscape that were no longer there. The consequence of this is that people went out and spent a lot of effort trying to find and reconstruct what had gone on and to find more of these birds and more of these fantastic animals that occurred in this landscape. And New Zealand's remarkable in a couple of ways. One is it's a big place, it's a lot of land area, and we've got this extremely recent human arrival. So people only got there about 700 years ago. Because it's a big land area, there are lots of sites available for bone preservation, so bones get preserved in places like caves and sand dunes and swamp deposits, and also in the sites associated with Maori occupation, archaeological sites. And so there were numerous sites for bone preservation, and that coupled with the recent arrival also meant there was a major collection effort by Europeans to document and understand what had gone on here. So New Zealand really is quite unique in having such a large collection of material available and a major effort that went into understanding what was on here. And the consequence of that all is that New Zealand is the only place in the world where we have an idea, a complete reconstruction of what used to be in New Zealand before humans arrived. We've got a complete reconstruction of what the fauna used to look like, and it was an avifauna. New Zealand was a land almost completely dominated by birds. So even early on, and this is an old painting, people were having a go based on what they were finding in these bone collections on what New Zealand must have looked like before people got there on the basis of what they were finding in these bones. So here's an early painting kind of reconstructing past New Zealand with a number of prehistorically extinct birds that Europeans had never seen. Moa, this thing, an adspill, and some of the contemporary species like kiwi that still persist in the landscape. So as I said, New Zealand and this Pacific region I'm going to talk about was a land dominated by birds. There were no terrestrial land mammals. There were a few species of bats that had colonised these islands, but there were no other terrestrial land mammals present. So, like I said, we've got a unique insight in a place like New Zealand into what the world was like before humans arrived at places. And we know in New Zealand that there were 131 bird species that bred on the main islands of New Zealand before human contact, based on these extensive bone collections. And we know also then that there were 40 species of bird that have disappeared from the mainland that Europeans have never seen. They disappeared in the time between first human arrival, between Maori settlement, and when Europeans got there. And the dating on this is all really good. The evidence is that all of the birds disappeared post-human arrival. And I'm sort of going to cut to the chase here. All of the evidence points to the fact that the major drivers of extinction of these birds following human arrival was down to two factors: human hunting and rat predation. So when Maori arrived in New Zealand and across the Pacific, they brought with them as well a commensal rat species. In New Zealand it's called the Kiori, Rattoseculans, and it's widespread across Pacific Islands and present in New Zealand. And it's a predator, and all the evidence suggests that prehistoric extinction in New Zealand was primarily driven by these two forces. And I'll just run through a bit of the evidence we got that's the case, just to sort of illustrate. All right, the first bit of evidence we've got is that we've got direct evidence from archaeological sites that Maori killed and ate birds. And so up the top here is a photograph of a butchery site of Moa. And so the characteristics of that are that we've got blackened bones that have been cooked and eaten, and we've got dismembered skeletons where people have taken the things apart to eat them. So, and then associated with this would be a number of other archaeological objects that links us directly to sort of human activity. So there's a large number, and actually a lot of the bones come from these archaeological sites. They were essentially the rubbish tips where people discarded their bones and material. And so we can see clear, direct evidence that people consumed and ate birds. And in fact, the sites, particularly for moa sites that they found, these moa butchery sites, were often incredibly extensive. I mean, just vast numbers of bones of moa at these sites. So there's records in the lower South Island, for instance, of farmers finding these butchery sites on their properties and hauling the bones out and grinding them up and spreading them on their paddocks for fertiliser. There were just so many bones in some of these locations. So, extensive evidence of hunting and killing birds. The second thing that's clear is that the kinds of species that went extinct in New Zealand were precisely those species that had the sorts of traits that we would associate with being vulnerable to hunting and being easy to hunt. So here, for example, I've just shown you of the species that went extinct and those that survived this period. So the proportion of birds in each of these classes that were flightless. And one of the key things is that a large proportion of the birds that disappeared in New Zealand were species that were flightless, that either lost the ability to fly since they arrived in New Zealand, or that come from groups that are known to be flightless, like the moa. Most of the birds that survived and didn't go extinct were able to fly. And that's one of the features that probably made a lot of these birds vulnerable to hunting and human predation pressure, was the fact they were relatively easy to catch because they couldn't fly. And there's a good reason for that, and that's in large part the absence of land mammals in New Zealand for the 60 million years prior to humans arriving. And in the absence of land mammals, a lot of birds lose the necessity to have a flight response to predators, because as far as mammal predation goes, that's one of the major means that birds use to escape predation from predators on the ground. And in New Zealand there were no ground-dwelling mammalian predators, and a lot of the birds evolved or lost the ability to fly, and a consequence of that too was that they tended to become much larger bodied as well. And so it's not just birds like moa that can't fly, there's a whole bunch of birds that can fly elsewhere in the world but lost the ability to fly once they got to New Zealand. So for instance, there's this large sort of goose-like species that was present in New Zealand that had lost the ability to fly and is no longer there, went extinct. And there's a strange creature, the adsbill, that no one really quite knows where its taxonomic affiliations sit, but it was a ground-dwelling flightless predator that probably used to run around the ground and predate on birds' nests and other things it could find on the ground. So it wasn't just these big moas that were flightless, a whole bunch of smaller birds became flightless. And the consequences I mentioned of becoming flightless is that they also tend to become much bigger bodied as well. And again, that's a feature that probably makes them highly susceptible to predation, because from a profitability point of view, if you're hunting big birds is a good outcome. And so what we see is that the extinct birds tended to be of much larger body mass than the non-extinct birds. And this is on a sort of multiplicative scale. So the difference here is really a difference of about 10 times in weight. So extinct birds were on average about 10 times as heavy as the non-extinct birds. So again, both of those are suggestive or certainly consistent with the idea that hunting was important, because the birds that we see disappearing out of the landscape are those birds we would think would be particularly vulnerable to that outcome. But it wasn't just hunting that was important. As I mentioned before, in places like North America, a lot of the large-bodied predators also went extinct, things like saber-toothed cats. And the same thing's true here in New Zealand. So one of the flighted birds that went extinct was this eagle here, this thing called Harpagornis, or Haas eagle. And this is the largest eagle known, ever recorded. It was a forest bird. Its closest relative is a small eagle here in Australia. Its ancestor arrived in New Zealand and it became this enormous bodied eagle. And its primary prey were most likely moa. And in fact, there's clear evidence that they did predate on moa. There are examples of moa pelvises with puncture marks that match exactly to the talons of one of these Harpagornis eagles that have just punched holes right through the pelvis bone of a moa. So there's direct evidence that these things predated on moa. And most likely when moa went extinct, with the prey gone, Harpagornis went extinct as well. So there's evidence these are also found in archaeological sites as well. And you can imagine these things would take small children away. I'd imagine Maori wouldn't want those hanging around the campsites either. Fearsome predator. All right, the third thing that's clear is that extinction occurred really rapidly. And this is a bit of a complicated graph, and I just want to highlight a couple of points. There's a timeline along here. Here's the dating of human arrival at 1280 in New Zealand. And these are dates of, and don't worry about the green ones there, they're not part of the story, but if you look at the blue ones, these are radiocarbon dates of moa bone that are found in archaeological sites, and they're bars because there's uncertainty around those dates. We're never quite sure exactly what the dates are, what the precise dates are for radiocarbon, so these span the dates. Each line is a date from a moa bone found in an archaeological site. Now, one of the problems we know with bone dating from radiocarbon is that it can be quite unreliable. And we can see down here some estimates from bones that probably are a little outliers, and that may be ones that aren't as reliable as the others. So the other thing that we can find in archaeological sites is eggshell, moa eggshell. And eggshells can be much more reliably dated by radiocarbon. So what we've got here in red then are the bands of moa eggshell that have been dated from archaeological sites in New Zealand. So you can see the dates coincide. They start with human arrival. We start finding moa eggshell in archaeological sites. They stop within less than 200 years after human arrival. In fact, between 1 and 200 years ago, most bones and all of the eggshell drops out of archaeological sites. And that suggests most likely they fall out because they were gone. They were extinct in the landscape by within 1 to 200 years of human arrival in this landscape. And there's other changes in these archaeological sites that we can see that suggest that the resources were depleted really rapidly. So early on in midden sites, at the bottom of these midden sites for the earliest dates, you find large intact legs of moa. And as you move further up and find more recent sites, you find that the legs have been smashed open and the marrow taken out of them. And almost certainly that reflects early on there was no need to go and eat the marrow because there was so much moa meat around, and they just left the legs intact. And quite quickly, as the resource depleted, they started to have to utilise the rest of the bird, and you see them using things like marrow and other shifts in diet that indicate they were forced to start to eat seafood and other kinds of protein sources. So extinction looks like it occurred really fast in this landscape. So hunting by humans, I mentioned, was a key driver. An exception to that, an exception to the rule of these large-bodied flightless birds going extinct, was also the fact that across New Zealand we saw a major loss of seabirds off New Zealand. Most of these birds didn't go globally extinct because the birds are found on outlying islands in New Zealand or elsewhere in the Pacific, But what we see on mainland New Zealand is these birds disappeared off the mainland. So about half of the species of seabird were extirpated from the mainland, and all of the birds that went extinct had small eggs. Now, a feature of these seabirds is that they nest in burrows. And so they'll forage out at sea, but they'll come in to nest, they'll dig burrows, and they'll raise their chicks and young in these burrows. And that makes them especially susceptible to predation by a ground-dwelling mammal like a rat. And rats in particular, the Pacific rat, handle small eggs much better than they do big eggs. And so again, this pattern is highly consistent with the idea that in addition to hunting, we had on the ground rats coming in and cleaning out these ground-dwelling burrowing seabirds. All right, I've sort of focused a bit on New Zealand because we've got such a good record of what went on there, and it really provides us with this opportunity to understand what the impacts of human arrival have been on this landmass. And so we know recent arrival, extinction was extremely rapid, and the big drivers look to be hunting and predation by rats. What's much less clear is what went on across the remaining sort of vast area of this Pacific Ocean, and that's what I want to talk about now, and that's really the focus of the recent work that we've been doing. And the issue here is that we just don't have the same complete record as what we've got in New Zealand. In New Zealand, there are tens of thousands of bird bones that provide us this really complete picture of what the world was like before humans got there. But when we get on to other Pacific islands where there are similar kinds of fossil records, the issue is that the fossil records are much less complete, in part because the islands are smaller and there are less sites available for preservation, and in part because there just hasn't been the collection effort put into finding and understanding these fossils as there has in New Zealand. So if we look across other Pacific islands that have been explored for these fossil things, you can see that most islands have got relatively few fossil bones recorded on them. A lot of islands, fewer than 100 bones have been recorded. The large majority of islands, less than 1,000 bones, and there are really only a few islands where we've got a reasonable number of fossil bones to reconstruct what went on. And that makes it difficult to understand in any kind of detail what happened. We know across the Pacific as well that there was a major extinction event. And so like the sort of iconic moa, there are a number of other iconic species on other Pacific islands that went extinct, including this strange bird here, Sylviornis, a kind of a megapode, a mound-building bird, but this is a 30-kilogram mound-building megapode, this enormous bird that strutted around the beaches of New Caledonia. And on the Hawaiian Islands, several species of these big flightless geese that lived on several of the Hawaiian Islands that almost certainly were the major herbivore species in these ecosystems before they went extinct. So we know across these islands there was a major extinction event. Just the details are far more sketchy because we only just have these sort of brief insights into what the species were. We don't have this complete reconstruction. And that poses a real problem for us, and I just want to illustrate why it's a real issue. And so here's an example of one of the islands that's been studied, the island of Iwa-Levu near Fiji. It's an island where people have collected fossil bones and tried to look at what the ancient fauna was. On this island here, there are 16 species that were recorded post-European arrival. So in the modern record, we know that there are 16 species present on this island. And on this particular island, there have only been 74 fossil bones discovered, and those 74 fossil bones we know come from 13 different species of bird. And of those 13 species of bird, 6 of them are species that are present in the modern record. So of the 16 species that we know are on this island, 6 of them have been found in the fossil record, and there are 10 species that are on the island but whose bones haven't yet been collected. Probably in large part because there's just so few bones being collected on this island. So we know we're there, we know these birds are there, we know they've been there for a long time, they should be in the fossil record, but we haven't found them. The other 7 species then that have been identified on this island out of the 13 are species that are no longer on the island and that no European has ever seen. And so they are species that have gone extinct prior to Europeans getting there and since human arrival. They're the prehistorically extinct birds. And the key issue is that given that there's 10 species missing out of this record here and only 6 present, it's highly likely that there's a whole lot of species missing out of this record here as well. So while we know there's 7 prehistorically extinct species on this island, there's at least 11 or 12 others, judging by how many we've got over here, that are missing from the fossil record. And this is a real problem people will face in trying to understand what went on other Pacific islands, is we've got all of this missing information that we don't know much about. But it turns out that this sort of problem and this sort of issue around missing species is the same sort of issue that confronts a lot of ecologists when they come to try to understand and enumerate animal populations. And so a common technique that people use to try to estimate the size of animal populations is the approach called mark recapture, where you let animals go, where you catch animals, you mark them, you let them go, and then you look at how many you recapture. And that's directly analogous to this sort of problem here, where we could think of all of these species here as being marked species that we could recapture in the fossil record. And that gives us some idea then, if we know the rates of sort of recapture in the fossil record, how many might be missing out of that record. And so the work we've done recently is to apply these kinds of ecological approaches to understanding these past extinction events and this missing information that we've got in the system. And so the recent work that we've done is to apply these kinds of mark recapture approaches to understand what went on these Pacific islands, given the information that we've got available from the fossil record. So I'm just going to sort of go through now applying this kind of approach, then what kind of insights and what this tells us about what's gone on out across these large Pacific islands. So the information we've got then are data from 41 islands across the Pacific on which fossil bones have been collected. So there's probably about 250 islands on which are large enough to support decent populations of birds and on which we might find fossil bird bones across the Pacific. So there's a relatively sort of small subset of these islands that have actually been explored and we've had fossil bone collections. When we apply these kinds of mark recapture approaches and reconstruct what must have gone out on these islands, the first thing we find is that the patterns that we see in terms of the kinds of species that went extinct are the same patterns that we see in New Zealand. So when we look at the characteristics of the species that have gone extinct and the characteristics of species that must be missing on the basis of those extinctions that have occurred and on the basis of the kinds of species that we're easily able to detect in the record, it's quite clear that what we're missing out of the record are an awful lot of these large-bodied flightless species that must have gone extinct on these islands. And again, I'll mention a few of the sort of key iconic kind of birds that disappeared, these Hawaiian geese, these Silviornis, but for the most part, most of the birds that disappeared on these islands were birds in quite widespread groups that include things like these megapodes, mound-building birds that suffered high rates of extinction across a lot of islands, species of rail that tend to evolve flightlessness really readily on these islands, that becomes flightless, large-bodied and really prone to extinction, and then also just parrots and doves and pigeons and birds like that also disappeared. But generally the more larger bodied species that we can find on these islands, and especially the flightless ones. So the pattern there is pretty much the same as what we see in New Zealand, and again consistent with the idea that it's hunting that's a major driver, particularly of these larger bodied birds that we see across these islands. But the other thing that this approach allows us to do is to actually look across the islands and to ask how islands differed in their rates of extinction. We know in New Zealand that about a third of the bird species went extinct prior to human arrival. How does that compare with other islands across the Pacific? And one of the striking things we see is that the extinction rates across these islands vary very markedly. So there are some islands, the big island on Hawaii, for example, in which we estimate fewer than 10% of the bird species went extinct. And you contrast that with Hook Island in French Polynesia, where 90% of the bird species on that island went extinct. So there's this wide variation in rates of extinction across the island, and an average of about 2/3. So New Zealand sits down the lower end of this thing. A third of the birds went extinct on New Zealand. On average across these islands, they were losing 2/3. And again, I should have said we're focusing on the large-bodied non-passerine birds here, not the very small perching songbirds. So These are the rates of extinction of these larger bodied birds across the island. So, one of the key questions is why the difference? Why are some islands suffering such high rates of extinction and others not? And just to give you a feel for why that is, I want to go back to New Zealand again and just talk about the takahe, which was one of the birds that was discovered soon after European arrival in the fossil record. So across New Zealand, there's fossil evidence that this bird was once previously widespread. It was a common discovery in archaeological and fossil sites across New Zealand, and so it was known that we had this large body, flightless rail species that went extinct in New Zealand some time ago. And then in the late 1800s, actually 3 specimens of this bird were actually found in a remote part down in Fiordland. So this is a bird species that looks like it was once widespread in New Zealand and had managed to hang on by the time Europeans got there and was recorded in a sort of a remote part of the South Island of New Zealand. 3 specimens were found in the late 1800s, and then it wasn't seen again for a long period of time and was assumed to be extinct. And then remarkably, in the late 1940s, this bird was rediscovered, and it's hard to this was a major scientific discovery, and it was a remarkable discovery too, because it was discovered by a doctor who lived down in Southland, who'd been out tramping in remote parts of Fiordland in the Murchison Mountains, and he'd heard this strange bird call that he'd never heard before, and he became convinced that he had heard a takahe, and he spent years traipsing around that part of New Zealand trying to locate this bird, and eventually one day he stumbled into this thing in this remote mountain valley, and it's a bird back from the brink of extinction. This thing that was widespread throughout New Zealand virtually disappeared during Maori arrival. It somehow hung on and then was rediscovered again in the 1940s. The closest relative of the takahe is the purple swamp hen, the thing you see wandering around on campus out here. So, some time ago, the ancestor of the purple swamp hen flew over to New Zealand, lost the ability to fly because it didn't need to fly anymore, and became this big, flat, wobbling around forest bird that lived on the forest floor. Maori hunted it, and it managed to hang on. Why did it hang on? Well, this is Takahe Valley, where Jeff Warble, the doctor from Southland, found this bird, and it's a rugged and remote place. And almost certainly, the reason Takahe managed to hang on here through both Maori occupation and then subsequent European occupation and the introduced predators Europeans introduced was because it lived in this incredibly remote valley in high mountains and a high rainfall area, intact native forest that no one had ventured into. And so its story of survival is probably a story of a refuge, and those kinds of refuges only occur in big land masses like New Zealand. And that's really part of the story of what the extinction pattern across the Pacific looks like. That if we look across the 41 islands in the Pacific, it's those islands it's the big islands that have the lower rates of extinction. And across these Pacific islands, it's the big islands that are also the most topographically rugged and the higher elevation. So it's really only the big islands where you find large inland mountain land masses that have the potential to provide the kinds of refuges like the takahe that allow it to persist through human arrival. So here's this is Pacific Island. It's actually not one of the ones that we looked at. This is actually off the coast of Chile, but it provides a good illustration of the degree to which lowland areas can be extensively modified by humans, and that was the case across the Pacific. Pacific cleared lowland forest, but we've got an inland sort of rugged interior that manages to survive and provides a potential refuge. So that's a key driver and a key pattern we see across the Pacific, is this difference in island size. The other thing we see is that islands in higher rainfall areas also had lower rates of extinction. And just to illustrate why that is, and again it's related to what I talked to just before in terms of this idea of refuges. Here's a satellite image of the big island of Hawaii. Now this island here's got a couple of major volcanoes on it, and they climb up to high elevation. And characteristic of these large Pacific islands, it has a windward and a leeward side. So the prevailing wind directions from here, and these green areas on the windward side are predominantly forest vegetation, or certainly prior to Europeans getting there, this area would have been mostly forested, and because it's a high rainfall area that catches the prevailing wind, and forest can persist in these high rainfall areas. It's much harder to clear, and it's much harder to keep forest away with high rainfall. And likewise on the higher flanks of the mountains around here. And then across this island here too, we have these leeward slopes, and it's most clearly demonstrated here by this almost straight line, where if you drive from Hilo over here, around the road through tropical rainforest, and you cross over the divide here, all of a sudden you're out into dry grassland on the leeward side of the mountain, where there's far less rainfall and where forest was readily cleared and did come back again. And so both larger islands tend to have these windward areas where forest refuges can persist, and in the wetter parts of the Pacific you had islands that were wet and in which forest had a much higher survival rate than on the very dry parts of the Pacific where forest was much easily denuded and cleared. And again, it probably links to this idea that where you're able to have rugged forest refuges, you've got opportunities for birds to persist and extinction rates are lower in those systems. I mentioned before that New Zealand's got a reasonably low extinction rate when we look across these Pacific islands. About a third of the birds disappeared relative to 2/3 on other islands. And New Zealand's got one of the highest numbers of endangered bird species in the world. And in large part, that's a quirk of nature. New Zealand is this rugged, remote landscape where a lot of these birds that would otherwise have gone extinct on other islands have managed to hang on. So the high number of highly endangered species in New Zealand, they occur there in New Zealand because of that quirk of geography. And they've just been eliminated off all the other islands where it was much easier to, they faced much higher rates of extinction as a consequence of these kinds of geographic features. So it's this interplay between human arrival and the geography of the situations that they find themselves in that lead to these different kinds of outcomes on different islands and the kinds of patterns that we see today in terms of extinction and endangerment. All right, so far I've sort of talked about individual islands and all of the sort of results that I've talked about have been from these 41 islands where we had these good fossil records to tell us what was going on. The other thing we might be interested in as well is the total number of extinctions across the whole Pacific region. And this is a sort of a trickier number to get at because on individual islands species can go extinct, but it's quite possible that those species were reasonably widespread, occurred on other islands, and they managed to survive in other areas. And so when we think about extinction on individual islands, it's a little bit different to thinking about the total number of extinctions. How many species went globally extinct across this Pacific region, never to be seen again. But the kind of approach that we use, this market capture approach, in trying to understand extinctions on individual islands, also allowed us to estimate, at least get a rough estimate of how many species in total went extinct across this area. Because we know that if a species was endemic to one island, in other words, it only occurred on a single island, then once it goes extinct on that island, it's gone extinct forever because it doesn't occur anywhere else. And so our approach actually allowed us to estimate how many species were there across Pacific Islands that were island endemics only and that went extinct as a part of this process. And when we do the calculations for the 41 islands and we extrapolate up to the roughly 250 or so islands that would have been capable of supporting an endemic bird, then we get this figure here, 983 birds lost across that Pacific region. And this distribution here just reflects the high degree of uncertainty that we've got in that number. It's a fuzzy number. Our best guess is 938, but our estimates could range from 600 up to 1,400 or so. There's a lot of uncertainty in that number just because we've got to sort of extrapolate up our numbers quite a bit. And that's almost certainly a conservative estimate because it only deals with island endemic species, so species that were only found on one island. There could be other species that were found on more than one island that went extinct as part of this process as well. And it's only these large-bodied non-passerine birds. It doesn't include seabirds and small perching songbirds as well. So that's a minimum estimate of what we think numbers of extinctions would have been. And I'll just put that number in perspective. We know at the moment in the world there's around about 10,000 bird species. And so the roughly 1,000 or so bird species that went extinct on these Pacific Islands represents about 10% of global bird diversity. And just and again, just to think about this a little bit more, that's happened in the last few thousand years, and on the islands of Hawaii, New Zealand, and many of the far-flung islands within the last 700 years. So within this blink of an eyelid in geological time, we have lost 10% of the world's bird diversity across the Pacific in the last few thousand years. All right. I just want to finish up with a couple of quotes, just to. And Joseph Banks was Cook's naturalist, and this is a quote from his diary on Cook's first expedition to New Zealand, where he was anchored in the Endeavour off the coast of New Zealand. And as he said, "This morning I was awake by the singing of the birds ashore, from whence we were distanced not a quarter of a mile." So he's anchored in his boat offshore, and he's been woken up in the morning by the sounds of birds singing on the shore next to the boat. And he says, "The numbers of which were certainly very great, who seemed to strain their throats with emulation perhaps. Their voices were certainly the most melodious, wild music I have ever heard." Now, there's two things about this quote that really strike me. One of them is that Banks arrived in New Zealand at a time after which 30% of the avifauna had already disappeared. So he's arriving in a landscape that's already been pretty devastated by human arrival. And he's lying in his boat offshore, and he's been awoken by an abundance of birds on the shore, singing so loud that they wake him from his sleep. And the early European arrivals in New Zealand used to talk about the deafening sound that the dawn chorus made in the morning when the birds wake them up. So, if this is what Banks encountered when he arrived in New Zealand, it's hard to imagine what the first Maori must have encountered when they arrived in New Zealand in terms of a diversity of bird forms and an abundance of birds. The Pacific and New Zealand were the land of birds before people got there. So I guess that's the first thing I'll take out of this quote. But the second thing is a much more sobering one, and that is if you walk around the forests of New Zealand now, you don't hear deafening dawn choruses like that. In fact, New Zealand forests are often quite eerily quiet compared to a lot of other forests that you go into, and certainly compared to waking up here in Australia. And of course, I guess the sad part of this is that while I've talked about a wave of extinction that accompanied first human arrival on these islands, there was a second wave of extinction that followed once Europeans got there. And that really was driven by, again, the predators that the Europeans introduced into the system, for which these birds had little or no defence against. Things like cats, black rats, Norway rats, mustelids, and things like, in Australia here, foxes, those kinds of predators. So that's two key things. And I guess I'll just finish with a quote from an Australian, no less. It just reinforces that sentiment about what New Zealand is like now. That to my great regret, I arrived in the late 20th century only to find most of the orchestra seats empty. Walking through the ancient forests whose still living trees were once browsed by moa. So, he's just referring to the fact that only 700 years ago these birds were there, and a lot of the trees in the New Zealand landscape would have had moa browsing under them. So it's just the sort of immediacy with which this occurred. I heard nothing but the whisper of leaves blowing in the wind. It was like the rustle of the last curtain fall on an orchestra that will be no more. So that's an Australian's perspective on what it's like now to go to New Zealand and to see what the forests are like. So I'll finish on that sobering note. And thanks to a number of people who have helped me with this work, and that's again a picture of I guess a sort of an artist's take as well on the kinds of changes that have occurred in New Zealand. Walter Buller was a famous naturalist. Thanks.
I'm just wondering if there's any evidence that nocturnal species, like the kiwi, fared a little better on the islands because they're more difficult to hunt, or is there just not enough nocturnal species to really assess that?
Yeah. I guess being nocturnal is a plus, particularly if you're hunted by people. A lot of the extinct species we don't know whether they were nocturnal or not. We can't really infer, from bone structures, what they did. I suspect that being nocturnal is an advantage, and part of the reason birds like kiwi persisted may well be to do with the fact that it's harder to hunt birds at night than during the day. Yeah. Yep. I think also, I guess when I'm just sort of running through my head, nocturnal birds, and there's a few of them that persisted. So, and I'm not sure it's anything that anyone's ever highlighted as being a key feature, but you might be right. Yeah.
Thanks for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. I've got a question. Did anyone try, because I'm still puzzled that humans are that seem to be the main driver to kill all the birds within New Zealand. Did anyone try to estimate how many birds would have to be eaten by humans in 300 years? Because the population density probably was fairly low at the beginning.
Yeah.
Anyone tried this kind of back out on the envelope estimation? If
They
that's
have,
possible
yes.
at all?
Yes, they have. And they've only done it, as far as I'm aware, for moa. But all of the population modelling, so an issue with moa is that they were hunted at both ends. So the adults were hunted for food and the nests were hunted for eggs, because these enormous eggs. And there's good evidence that eggs were both eaten and also used as, for storage and for shipping water around, that sort of thing. So yeah, they suffered predation at both the egg stage and the adult stage, and all of the population modelling suggests that would drive them extinct within. In fact, the population modelling suggests they would have gone extinct within 100 years. The archaeological record suggests maybe a little longer than that, but both are ballpark consistent. So certainly for moa, and I'm not aware that people have done the same kinds of demographic modelling work for other bird species. But, I guess the same would probably apply for a lot of the flightless ground nesting birds, is that they would also be susceptible to egg predation as well. And I mean, that's a real killer for these species.
Does the fate of the moa suggest that the New Zealand population was fairly large to begin with and maybe built up fairly steadily? But it sounds to me as though there was a pretty big impact fairly quickly, which suggests that a lot of people arrived pretty well all at once.
Yes, and I think, I think the consensus is that it was a targeted migration, so that people just didn't arrive, on a sort of shipwreck and end up on the shores of New Zealand. That there was a concerted effort 700 or 800 years ago from the Society Islands. There was a concerted migration of people out from that area, with the intent to find new places to live. So it looks like there was, and people don't know the exact numbers. But there's likely, and I think there has been some work trying to estimate that from sort of genetic remains, but I think certainly evidence is that there was a reasonable founding population, but I don't think we know quite how big that was. And presumably with the kinds of resources that were available, there was the opportunity for that population to increase quite rapidly with the food sources that were available initially. Yeah.
Richard, extending that line of questioning, you mentioned that the migrations around the Pacific were sort of reasonably punctuated.
Yeah.
Stuck. Is there any evidence that some of that might have been driven by resource, people hitting the ceiling of resources available? Like, is there any synchrony between the estimated time of the mass migrations and your fossil evidence on extinction?
Yeah, no, not that I'm aware of, and I think there's considerable debate among archaeologists as to what has driven this, and I'm not sure there's any consensus or agreement. And I guess one of the key things is the work that illustrates that migratory work only came out in 2011. So work from Landcare Research in New Zealand by Janet Wilmshurst and colleagues here at ANU, Athol Anderson, and so I think this very recent understanding of these sort of pauses and hops and then major movements is a relatively recent finding, and I think they're still coming to grips with why there were pauses and why such sudden movement. And I think there's various theories around to do with resource use, but also I think to do with potential disasters in that area that may have initiated people leaving. Yeah.
Okay, I think we might pull it to an end there. So if you'd like to join with me in thanking Richard once more in the usual way.
All right.